Hollows Gate Amusement Park lay in a forgotten stretch of rural land, where the road leading to its gates narrowed into cracked asphalt and the power lines sagged, as though even they were reluctant to feed the place energy. And on the night I first arrived for duty as its sole night guard, the air carried an oppressive stillness that was not born from weather, but from something older, something aware. The job had been offered with little ceremony. No interview beyond a few questions about my ability to stay awake. And upon arrival, I was handed a tarnished flashlight, a static-flecked walkie-talkie, and a laminated sheet of rules so strange they felt less like workplace policy and more like a list of rituals required to keep something in its place. Lock the front gates at exactly 10:05 p.m. or suffer the knocking. Never approach the carousel if music begins after midnight, and flee immediately if the horses breathe. Turn away from a moving Ferris wheel if its booth is empty. Never respond to clowns because they are no longer part of the park. Ignore the sound of your own voice calling at precisely 3:33 a.m. Cut the power to the popcorn stand if its lights flare and escape within 30 seconds. Eat nothing found within the park's boundaries. And never leave your post until the PA system plays music to mark sunrise, no matter how long the darkness lingers. And though I had initially dismissed the list as the eccentric invention of some aging park owner, there was a quiet authority in the typewritten words that pressed against my mind as the first hours unfolded. The park's layout was simple but strange, a crooked horseshoe of midway games and rides curving around a central plaza, with the carousel standing at its heart and the Ferris wheel looming beyond like the skeletal spine of a long-dead giant, its silhouette barely visible against the starless sky. And for nearly 2 hours, the only sounds were the occasional creak of metal settling and the wind sifting through brittle pennants, until at 11:42 a.m. low, indistinct music seeped through the air, too muted to identify, yet carrying the unmistakable texture of something mechanical and aged. But when I scanned the midway, no lights glimmered and no ride moved, leaving me to believe it might have been an echo from memory rather than reality. But at 12:07 the sound came again, this time sharp and undeniable. The carousel's warped melody breaking the stillness in a looping tune I'd never heard yet. Instantly dreaded, and beneath it, faint but precise, came the sound of breathing, steady, rhythmic, and in perfect synchronization with the rise and fall of the music, as if each wooden horse were exhaling in time with the notes, their chests invisible in the darkness, but somehow alive with the effort. And though every instinct screamed to investigate, the rules commandment rooted me in place until I backed away into the security booth with deliberate, measured steps, the breathing fading only. When I had retreated far enough for the music to become a distant echo, the stillness held for another hour until 2:16, when a subtle grinding drifted from the far edge of the park and the great wheel began to turn, its rusted joints protesting each rotation while the seats swayed gently as if passengers rode them despite the emptiness. And my flashlight's beam cut through the shadows to reveal the operator's booth standing deserted, its door yawning open toward me like an invitation to break. The second most impossible commandment on the list, yet I obeyed instead, extinguishing my light and forcing my body into a steady retreat without once glancing back, each step taken against the heavy pull of curiosity and the unnatural sensation that the wheel itself wanted me to turn and witness what rode its frame. When at last I reached the safety of my booth, the wheel was silent again, its arms rigid against the sky as if it had never moved at all, and the silence that followed was suffocating in its purity, as though the entire park was holding its breath in anticipation. The hours crawled, and the darkness seemed to thicken instead of ease, until at 5:58 the PA system clicked alive with a bright, cheerful voice I had never heard before, thanking the visitors for coming and inviting them to return, though no one had entered through the locked gates all night. And the sound of that voice seemed to carry with it a subtle shift in the air, not toward daylight, but toward a different kind of awareness. And still the sky remained black, the park cloaked in the same oppressive gloom as when I had arrived. I stayed rooted in my post until the first pale light finally bled across the horizon at 7:15, far later than morning should have come, the dawn arriving reluctantly, as though forced into place by some reluctant hand, and when it did, it was thin and cold, lacking the warmth that normally accompanies the sun, and as I left through the main gates, I felt the weight of the park pressing against my back, not in farewell, but in promise. A promise that this was only the introduction, and that the rules were not a precaution. They were a warning written by someone who had survived long enough to leave them behind, and whose absence in the park's records might be explained by what happens to those who fail to follow them. The second night began with an unease that clung to me from the moment I left my apartment, an almost physical resistance in my chest, as though some part of me already knew the park was waiting for me. And by the time I drove the 30 miles of empty road to Hollow's Gate, the sinking orange of sunset had already faded into a deep, indifferent darkness that swallowed the tree line beyond the asphalt. I unlocked the security booth and repeated the same procedure as the previous night, moving with mechanical precision as I checked the padlock on the gates and walked the silent midway, my flashlight beam cutting narrow tunnels through the fog, the skeletal shapes of rides looming from the shadows like dormant predators. The rules remained in my pocket, but I no longer needed to read them, each one etched into my mind with the clarity of instinct. And at exactly 10:05 p.m., I clicked the padlock, closed on the gates, and felt, for just a second, the unmistakable sensation that something on the other side had taken a single step closer. The first hour passed without incident, and I dared to believe perhaps the previous night's events had been an anomaly, a cruel joke of sound and shadow. But at 11:13 it began, a faint tapping, irregular but deliberate, on the metal bars of the front gate, like the hesitant knocking of someone who wasn't sure they should be there. And as the sound continued, it shifted in rhythm, growing more certain, as if gaining confidence from my inaction. The rules were clear. If the gates were locked and there was knocking, I was never to open them. And so I remained still, watching from the booth as the knocking grew sharper, the sound carrying unnaturally well through the heavy air, until the pattern changed into a slow, steady pound, the force reverberating through the ground beneath my feet as though the gates themselves were trembling. The longer I listened, the more I felt certain it wasn't hands striking the metal, but something else, something heavier. In my mind's eye began forming shapes I refused to focus on. Too tall, too narrow, with movements that did not match the sound's weight. And after 13 minutes the pounding ceased without warning, replaced by a silence so absolute it rang in my ears. I held my breath, waiting, and then came the voice, my own voice, low and precise, speaking my name in a way I had never heard myself speak, not urgent, not pleading, but beckoning, drawing the syllables out with a slow, patient hunger. And even though the rules warned against following it at 3:33 a.m., this was far earlier, and my thoughts wavered at the loophole, until a sudden shift in the air at my back sent a cold instinct through my body that whatever was speaking was no longer at the gates. I did not turn around, forcing myself to resume my slow patrol along the midway, and for the next hour the park seemed to breathe around me, the air occasionally moving without wind, the shadows twitching in ways I pretended not to see. At 12:47, the carousel lit up all at once, every bulb burning pale gold, its mirrors reflecting shapes that did not correspond to the horses they framed, and the music began, not the warped, clattering melody from the night before, but a slow waltz, heavy with the weight of something ceremonial. And though the rules said nothing about the lights, the music alone was enough to keep me from stepping closer, especially when I noticed that each horse's head had turned slightly toward me, the shadows, at their jaws deepening as if they were smiling. I retreated again to the booth, my pulse drumming with an animal panic, and sat there in tense vigilance until 2:09, when the Ferris wheel began its groaning ascent into motion, the seats swinging with unnerving precision, as though each one carried an invisible occupant shifting in time. I followed the procedure, turning off my flashlight, walking away, eyes locked forward. But this time, as I passed the row of midway game stalls, I caught a faint reflection in the glass of the ring toss booth. The wheel was not carrying empty seats at all, but silhouettes of riders who sat impossibly still, their faces obscured by shadows deeper than the surrounding dark. And though my rational mind screamed at me to look away, some other part of me counted each seat that passed in that reflection, and when I reached the 12th, the figure in it turned its head toward the glass as though it had been counting me. My pace quickened, my breath shallow, and only when I reached the far end of the midway did the wheel grind back into stillness. The remainder of the shift was quiet in sound, but loud in presence, as if the park had drawn closer to me in ways I could not measure. And when the PA crackled at 5:58, the same cheerful voice thanked the visitors for their time, but this time it added something new. 4 soft piano notes, descending, each one colder than the last. And again, the sky beyond the gates was untouched by dawn. I waited because I had no choice, because the rules forbade leaving before the music, and at 7:09 the first threads of pale light appeared, though they seemed weaker than the day before, the color of ash rather than gold. And as I walked to my car, I glanced once at the gates and saw, in the narrow space between their bars, 2 faint impressions in the dirt, perfectly aligned, as though something had been standing there for a very long time, waiting for me to unlock them. By the third night, the fear no longer arrived in sudden waves, but as a constant undertone, an awareness that the park did not sleep between my shifts, that it observed me even when I was not there. And as I drove the empty road beneath the heavy sky, I felt an irrational certainty that something unseen was pacing me through the tree line, keeping exact time with my headlights. Upon arrival, I performed the gate check with precise timing, snapping the lock shut at 10:05 as though the sound itself might be part of the ritual keeping the night contained. And as I turned away, I thought I saw a movement through the fog, slow, swaying, too far away to identify, but I did not pause to confirm it. The first hour passed without the now familiar carousel music or Ferris wheel motion, but at 11:28, as I approached the far edge of the midway, I saw a faint glow in the distance, a warm flicker out of place in the surrounding gloom, and my pulse tightened as I recognized its source, the popcorn stand, its cracked red and white paint catching the light of its own bulbs, which burned with a sickly yellow too bright for their age. The rules were unambiguous. If the popcorn stand lights turn on, unplug it at the breaker box and leave within 30 seconds. And though I had memorized the park's breaker locations, the nearest one to the stand sat just beyond a row of ring-toss stalls, in a shadowed alcove that felt cut off from the rest of the park. I forced my pace into something measured, unwilling to run but aware that every second stretched the rule's limit. And as I drew closer, the smell reached me, hot, sweet, and cloying, but beneath it something metallic, like the tang of a coin pressed against the tongue. When I rounded the last corner, I saw that the machine inside was already spinning, tossing kernels into the air where they burst open in perfect rhythm, each one landing in a pile that never seemed to grow higher, as though the machine had been working for hours without producing anything more than a shallow layer. I avoided looking directly at the glass, afraid I might see a reflection that didn't belong to me, and reached the breaker, throwing the switch down with a snap. Instantly, the lights died, the smell evaporated, and the machine's whirring cut off mid-turn. Yet the silence that followed felt less like relief and more like a held breath, as if the stand itself were listening. I stepped backward, my watch confirming I had taken only 24 seconds. But as I moved away, I noticed the kernels still sitting in the bin, each one perfectly still, yet they seemed to pulse faintly with some inner light, their shadows shifting subtly, as though they contained something moving within. I didn't stop to study them, retreating until the stand was swallowed by fog. For the next 2 hours the park was still, though my thoughts were not, circling back to that pulsing light until I found myself unconsciously avoiding that end of the midway, at 2:53. However, avoidance became impossible. Soft scraping noises began behind me no matter where I walked, the sound of something dragging across the asphalt, always just out of sight, and when I stopped, the sound stopped with me, but never instantly, always after a single delayed scrape. The rules didn't mention this, which in some ways made it worse, because without guidance I was left to trust instinct. And instinct told me to keep moving until the sound faded. When it finally did, I found myself near the carousel, its painted horses inert in the dark, but their glass eyes seemed to follow me as I passed. By 3:33, I was back at the booth, and though I braced for the rule-bound voice to call my name, none came. Yet I could not shake the feeling that its absence was not mercy but strategy, as though the park were learning me, adjusting its approach. At 4:41, the Ferris wheel began to move again, but this time I was already in its line of sight, the reflection in the booth's small window, catching its motion even as I faced forward. and in that reflection, I saw the seats sway in exact counterpoint to the wind's direction, their rhythm too deliberate to be mechanical. I shut my eyes and counted backward from 100 until the grinding stopped. When the PA activated at 5:58, the cheerful voice repeated its thanks but now added, in the same tone, the words, "Don't keep them waiting." I stood frozen, uncertain if it had been meant for me, and when dawn came, again late, again gray, I approached the gates to find a single piece of popcorn resting in the dirt just inside. Its surface cracked open to reveal a dark interior that absorbed light rather than reflected it. And though I didn't touch it, I felt with sudden clarity that it was not something left behind, but something placed. By the fourth night, the fear had stopped feeling like an invader and instead had become part of my own body, an extra pulse beneath my skin. And as I drove toward Hollow's Gate, I felt an irrational certainty that the park had already decided how this night would end. The air was thick with an early fog that swallowed my headlights, and when I arrived, the gates seemed closer than usual. The distance from the road compressed as though the park had drawn itself forward to meet me. I locked the gates at precisely 10:05, the click echoing unnaturally loud. But before I could step back, a single sharp knock struck the metal from the inside. So quick and precise it might have been a reflex, and without time to process, the sound was followed by the faint carousel tune, far too early for its usual midnight stirring, drifting through the fog in irregular fragments like a record spinning at the wrong speed. The rules had always been a sequence, a list of triggers that came one at a time. But tonight they seemed to bleed into one another, overlapping, as though the park no longer cared about the boundaries that had once contained it. By 10:41, the Ferris wheel began to groan into motion, its skeletal arms turning with a slow inevitability, and though I was still near the gates, the reflection of its movement flickered in the glass of the ticket booth beside me, showing not just the wheel but the carousel spinning in unison, its horses rising and falling without music now, their movements jerky, almost impatient. I began moving toward the breaker box to cut the power to the rides entirely. But the smell of hot sugar cut through the damp air, and when I turned my head, the popcorn stand's lights were on, their glow pale and strained, the machine inside churning without pause. Every instinct told me I couldn't reach the breaker in time, but I ran anyway, my steps echoing like I was inside a tunnel. And when I reached for the switch, the lights did not die, the glow simply deepened into something more solid, as if the light itself had become a substance. And the machine's output no longer resembled popcorn at all but small, pale shapes that tumbled out in clusters and dissolved into the air before touching the bin. I backed away, my breath clouding in front of me despite the warm night, and the moment I turned toward the booth for safety, the PA system crackled, not at its usual 5:58, but now, in the dead center of the night, and the voice spoke in its same bright cadence, "It's time to take your place," followed by that descending four-note piano phrase that lodged in my chest like a command. Almost immediately, the fog began to shift against the wind, curling inward along the midway, pulling itself toward the center plaza where the carousel and Ferris wheel now moved in perfect synchronization, the lights of each reflecting against the other until the air between them shimmered like heat over asphalt. I had the sensation, stronger than thought, that stepping into that center would end something. Either my job or my life. And yet my legs began to move without my consent, drawn forward as if the ground beneath me tilted toward the plaza. From the edge of my vision, shapes began to match my pace. Not quite humanoid, but tall enough to meet my gaze if I looked directly at them. And in each brief flicker of light, they seemed to shift positions, always staying just out of direct view. When I reached the center, the music from the carousel swelled. Not from its usual warped organ, but from the park itself, a layered harmony of every tune I had ever heard here. Cheerful jingles, slow waltzes, distorted lullabies, all rising in a single, vibrating chord that seemed to hold my bones in place. The Ferris wheel's seats now moved with visible weight, each one carrying the silhouette of something that was no longer trying to hide, their heads tilted toward me in unison. And the carousel's horses had all turned fully to face outward, their carved mouths open wider than would should allow, as though inhaling the night air in preparation. The voice from the PA spoke again, still warm and unhurried. Only one more night. And as those words fell into the heavy fog, every light in the park went out at once, leaving me in absolute darkness that felt less like the absence of sight and more like the presence of something vast and waiting. I did not move until the first gray hint of dawn crept into the fog, and when I turned to leave, I found that the gates were already unlocked, the padlock resting on the ground as if it had been placed there gently, waiting for me to pick it up for the last time. The fifth night began before I had even left my apartment, though I did not realize it until much later. The sense of being watched had followed me through the day like a pressure behind my eyes, subtle at first, but sharpening as dusk approached, and by the time I drove toward Hollow's Gate, I understood in a way that bypassed thought that the park was no longer a location I visited. It was a condition I inhabited. The road seemed shorter than before, the tree-line pressing closer, and when the gates came into view, they were already standing open, the padlock absent, as though the rule of locking them at 10:05 had become irrelevant. Stepping inside felt different tonight, the air thicker, the fog more luminous, each droplet reflecting light from no discernible source, and the rides were already moving without sound, the carousel's horses gliding in a slow, endless circle while the Ferris wheel turned at an unnerving steadiness, the seats swaying like pendulums in perfect synchronization. I tried to walk the perimeter as always, but the midway had shifted, the familiar crooked horseshoe path stretched and warped so that each turn led me closer to the center plaza no matter which direction I took. The stalls repeating like mirrored images, each one subtly wrong. Prizes that breathed, shelves that leaned toward me when I passed, shadows that grew sharper under my gaze. At 11:22 the PA system spoke without static, the voice clearer than I had ever heard it, saying, "Only, you've learned the rules, now follow them home." And in the silence that followed I realized there was no sound of night insects, no wind, only the rhythmic pulse of the rides and my own heartbeat, and even that seemed to lag behind, as if sinking to something else. I kept moving, but the rules began to break around me. The popcorn stand lights flared though I was nowhere near a breaker, the smell of sugar and iron filling my lungs. The carousel music starting and stopping mid-phrase as if deciding what song to be. The Ferris wheel halting mid-turn and then lurching backward without warning. At 3:33, I heard my voice calling my name from every direction at once, layered in tones older and deeper than my own. And though I clamped my hands over my ears, the sound vibrated through my bones, guiding me toward the plaza whether I wanted to move or not. When I reached it, the fog condensed into columns that encircled me, each one containing the silhouette of a figure whose proportions were almost human but not quite, their limbs too long, their heads too still, and beyond them the ride spun faster, their lights no longer bulbs but small, burning points that seared afterimages into my vision. The voice from the PA returned, now close enough to feel its breath against my ear, whispering, "The rules keep them out until you're ready." And I understood then that I had never been protecting myself with those rules. I had been preparing myself for this moment, conditioning my movements, my timing, my obedience until I could be trusted to step into the center willingly. The ground beneath me began to tilt and flex, the asphalt groaning like wood under strain, and the carousel's horses dismounted their poles in slow, deliberate steps, their carved hooves striking the ground with a hollow resonance, their mouths opening wider until the joints cracked, revealing darkness within that pulsed like a heartbeat. The Ferris wheel stopped completely, every rider silhouette turning its head toward me in perfect unison, and in the instant that all was still, the voice spoke once more, not over the PA, but from everywhere, from the fog, from the ground, from inside my own chest. It's time. The lights of the park flared white, obliterating shadow, and I found myself at the gates again, my hands resting on the metal as if I had just closed them, though I could not remember walking there. The sky above was neither night nor day, a pale, featureless void that offered no warmth, and behind me, the park stood silent, every ride frozen, every bulb dead. I stepped outside, and the gates closed on their own, the sound final. And when I turned toward the road, I saw that it no longer led toward town but into a horizonless gray, and in my pocket, the laminated rule sheet had changed. The familiar list replaced by a new set of instructions, shorter this time, just one line. Keep the gates locked. If they open, they will come. The paper was warm, as though it had been held by someone else only moments before, and as I began to walk, I realized with a hollow certainty that my shift had not ended, that it would never end, and that the sunrise would not come again.